Mr. Mercer, your services are no longer required. This is your termination.
I see. I trust this is final.
It is. Collect your things and leave.
I need to transfer all assets from the Mercer Maritime Legacy Trust. All assets, sir? That's quite an unusual request. Unusual or not, please proceed. Right away, sir.
On a Friday afternoon that should have ended like any other, Corinne Voss, branch manager of Arden Gate Bank's Larchfield location, terminated Nolan Mercer in front of every employee on the floor. 11 years. That was how long Nolan had worked there, quietly handling the most complicated accounts, covering shifts without being asked, never once demanding recognition for any of it. He was a single father who packed his daughter's lunch every morning and stayed late every Thursday to help elderly clients understand their statements. Nobody who knew him would have called him a flight risk. Nobody would have called him a thief. But Corinne had found her reason. $9 missing from a transaction drawer. Nolan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He removed his employee badge, set it on the counter alongside his keys, and calmly asked how long it would take to transfer all assets held under the Mercer Maritime Legacy Trust to another institution. Corinne smiled. She assumed he meant something small. Then Miles typed in the account number, and the screen lit up with a balance of $86 million. The floor went silent, and Nolan looked like he had been waiting for exactly this moment. If you're new here, stories like this one are what this channel is about. Real situations, real consequences, and the people who refuse to stay quiet. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Nolan Mercer didn't talk about money at work. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had watched money change the way people treated each other. And he had no interest in being treated differently. At Arden Gate Bank's Larchfield branch, he was simply the senior account control specialist, the one who arrived 7 minutes early, kept his desk clean, and never left a case file unresolved at the end of the week. That reputation had taken 11 years to build, and he valued it more than anything a balance sheet could show. He lived with his daughter Iris in a 2-bedroom house 12 minutes from the branch. Iris was 15, sharp in the way that made teachers either love her or dread her parent-teacher conferences. She had her father's patience, but none of his restraint where Nolan absorbed information quietly before responding. Iris asked her questions the moment they formed. At dinner every Friday, she would explain whatever she was working on in school, a history essay, a debate argument, a science project, talking through her logic out loud, while Nolan listened the way he listened to complex client cases, fully, without interrupting, taking mental notes. The one thing Iris hated most, she had told him more than once, was when adults answered a hard question with "it's complicated." She considered that a form of lying. Nolan had raised her to think that way, which meant he couldn't afford to lie to her when things actually became complicated. What almost no one at the branch knew was that Nolan managed the Mercer Maritime Legacy Trust, a private family trust established by his father, who had spent 30 years building a regional shipping company before selling it and placing the proceeds into a structure designed to last beyond his lifetime. The trust held just over $86 million in a combination of cash, municipal bonds, and charitable allocations directed toward maritime scholarships, retirement housing for former dock workers, and financial literacy programs in coastal communities. Nolan had been named sole trustee 8 years ago, not because the money was meant to define him, but because his father believed he was the only one in the family who would treat the responsibility with the same seriousness as the assets themselves. He kept the trust at Arden Gate because his father had banked there. Inertia, partly, familiarity, partly, and until recently, no reason to leave. Corinne Voss had been branch manager at Larchfield for 4 years. Before that, she had spent 8 years climbing through 2 other regional institutions, accumulating a record of clean audits, strong fee revenue numbers, and the kind of performance reviews that made district leadership use words like exceptional and high potential, but without being asked. She had traded a marriage for the pace she kept. She had traded most of her weekends for the metrics she maintained. By the time she arrived at Larchfield, she had built an identity so thoroughly around professional performance that she no longer easily distinguished between protecting her branch and protecting herself. She was 3 months away from a regional director evaluation. Everything had to hold. Graham Deller ran the district from a glass-walled office 40 miles north. He was rarely visible at the branch level. His presence existed mostly as a name at the bottom of approval chains. Over the previous 3 years, every proposed adjustment to Larchfield's internal fee structure had passed through his desk. He had signed each one. He also called Corinne on the last business day of every month. And the call was always brief, and it always ended the same way. Is the fee revenue holding? Not how's the team, not any compliance concerns. Just that one question, in the same flat tone. Like someone checking a gauge rather than managing a person. Nobody at the branch had a strong impression of Graham Deller. They just knew his name appeared at the end of every approval chain, and that Corinne's posture changed slightly whenever she took his calls. The Friday it happened was the last Friday of the month. A surprise audit had been scheduled for Monday morning, which meant the entire branch was operating with the particular tension of people who had been told to act normal while knowing they were being observed. Compliance checklists had been reviewed. Client files had been organized. The break room had been cleaned twice. Corinne was more tense than anyone. Larchfield's internal fee revenue index had been running high, unusually high, for several quarters. And while high numbers were generally good news, the specific shape of this particular number was the kind that invited questions. Questions she didn't have clean answers for. Miles Renner discovered the discrepancy at 4:47 in the afternoon, 11 minutes before close. He was 26 years old and had been at the branch for 22 months. He ran the end-of-day reconciliation the way he'd been trained, methodically, without shortcuts. When his drawer came up $9 short, he didn't panic. He flagged it in the system, pulled his transaction log, and walked to the floor supervisor to report it exactly as the procedure required. He had done everything right. Corinne's response was not proportionate. She locked the transaction floor, instructed staff to remain at their stations, suspended 2 temporary system access credentials, and transformed what should have been a standard discrepancy notation into something that looked and felt like a criminal investigation. The energy in the room shifted immediately. People who had been preparing to leave for the weekend found themselves standing very still, waiting to understand what was happening. Her eyes moved to Nolan. Earlier in the afternoon, Nolan had stood near Miles's station to help him work through a flagged wire transfer, a legitimate request from a corporate client whose paperwork had a formatting error. Nolan had the seniority to assist, the knowledge to resolve it quickly, and no access to the cash drawer at any point during the interaction. But proximity, in Corinne's version of events, was enough, she announced, in front of the entire floor, that Nolan had been standing near the drawer before the discrepancy appeared. Nolan asked to see the security footage. Corinne declined, citing internal investigation protocol. He pointed out that he did not have the access vault code to open that drawer. She said a man with 11 years of experience knew how to work around system limitations. He asked what specific evidence she was acting on. She said the nature of the investigation didn't require her to share that with him at this stage. Each exchange was delivered in measured tones, which somehow made it worse. The termination letter was printed from Corinne's office and brought to the floor within 20 minutes. She had made the calculation quickly and confidently. A single father who had worked the same job for 11 years, who kept his head down and never made noise, was not a person who would create a scene. He would accept the paperwork, sign what needed signing, and leave. The whole situation would be contained before Monday. Nolan read the letter once. Then he folded it in half, placed it on the counter beside his badge, and looked at Corinne with an expression that gave nothing away. He asked one question. What was the standard processing time to initiate a full asset transfer for an institutional trust account? Corinne assumed he meant his personal checking account. Maybe a few $1,000s moved in frustration. The kind of gesture that looked significant to the person making it and meant nothing to the bank. She was so certain of this that she nodded toward Miles's station without hesitation, telling Nolan he could start the request there. She didn't stop to consider what she was agreeing to, because in her mind, a man she had just fired for stealing $9 wasn't a man who controlled anything worth worrying about. Miles pulled up the account. His fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. He read the number on the screen twice, because the first time didn't seem real. Then he looked up at Nolan, then at Corinne, then back at the screen. The balance on the Mercer Maritime Legacy Trust account was $86,400,217. The floor went the kind of quiet that happens when everyone in a room understands something at the same moment, but no one is sure what to do with the understanding. Corinne's expression didn't collapse immediately. It moved through several stages: confusion, recalculation, something close to recognition, before arriving at a stillness that was not composure. It was the face of someone who had just realized the math didn't work the way she thought it did. Nolan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the transaction adjustment line that had appeared on Miles's screen. When the trust account loaded a small fee notation, $9, coded L09. He had seen that code before. He had asked about it before. He had submitted 2 internal queries about it in the past 14 months and received form responses that closed the ticket without explanation. He didn't say anything about the code, not yet. He simply confirmed that he wanted to proceed with the full transfer and asked Miles to initiate the paperwork. By the time Nolan walked out of the branch, the parking lot was almost empty. The sky had gone gray and flat in the way that late autumn afternoons do when the light gives up early. He sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine, not because he was shaken, but because he wanted to think clearly before he moved. He thought about Iris, who would ask him what happened the moment he walked through the door. He thought about the L09 code, and the 2 queries that had gone nowhere, and the pattern he had started to notice in the trust's fee history over the past 3 years. He thought about the fact that the audit was on Monday. Then he started the car and drove home. Iris was at the kitchen table when he came in, laptop open, highlighter in hand, a half-eaten sandwich beside her. She looked up, read his face the way she always did, quickly and accurately, and asked what happened. He told her the truth, without softening it. He had been terminated. The stated reason was a $9 discrepancy he had nothing to do with, and he had initiated a transfer of the trust account as a result. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, in exactly the tone he had come to expect from her, "So, what are you going to do now?" He opened his laptop, set it on the table beside hers, and said, "I'm going to go back to the beginning." She pulled her sandwich closer, settled into her chair, and didn't ask any more questions. She just stayed there, working on her own thing, while her father began pulling 36 months of trust account statements and laying them out in order across the screen. That was how they spent the evening side by side, each doing the work in front of them, the kitchen light on against the early dark. The first thing Nolan found was a pattern, not a dramatic one, not the kind that announced itself in bold numbers or obvious irregularities. It was the kind of pattern that only became visible when you laid everything flat and looked at it from a distance, the way you had to step back from a map to understand the terrain. 36 months of trust account statements, lined up in sequence on his kitchen table, each one representing a month in which the Mercer Maritime Legacy Trust had been charged small, quiet fees under the code L09, $9, $18, $27. Sometimes a charge appeared, then reversed, then reappeared 3 months later. Sometimes it vanished for a quarter, and came back slightly larger. The amounts were never large enough to trigger an automatic compliance flag. They were never small enough to look like rounding errors. They existed in a range that was precisely designed to be ignored, too minor to call about, too regular to be accidental. Nolan had noticed L09 before. 14 months ago, he had submitted an internal query asking for a fee code description. The response came back in 4 days. Fee code under review. No client action required. He had submitted a second query 6 months later. That one was closed with a single line. Standard account maintenance adjustment. No discrepancy identified. He had accepted those answers at the time because he had no reason not to. He accepted them the way most people accept small bureaucratic non-answers, with mild frustration, and the reasonable assumption that someone, somewhere, had a legitimate explanation. He no longer had that assumption. He opened his old client care notes, the informal records he kept on long-term accounts, the kind that never made it into official files, but that a careful account manager accumulated over years of follow-up calls and in-branch conversations. He found 3 separate notations from elderly clients who had asked him about small fees they didn't recognize. One woman, 73 years old, had called twice in 18 months about charges she described as too small to make a fuss about, but wrong enough to bother her. He had escalated both calls through the standard channel. Both had been resolved with a refund and a brief explanation that the fee was a system adjustment that had since been corrected. The fee had not been corrected. It had simply been paused. He cross-referenced the dates of those client calls with the L09 charge history on their accounts. The math was clean and terrible. Every account that generated a complaint received a refund and a 6-month suspension of the charge. Every account that stayed quiet continued to be charged, month after month, without interruption. It wasn't a glitch, it was a system. The next morning, Corinne called before 8. Her tone was different from the day before, controlled in a different way. The way a person sounds when they have rehearsed what they're going to say, and are working hard to deliver it naturally. She described the termination as an administrative misunderstanding. She said the investigation into the drawer discrepancy had been resolved overnight, no wrongdoing had been identified, and the matter was closed. She offered Nolan his position back, with a title adjustment, a salary increase of 12%, and a formal notation in his file clearing the record entirely. Nolan listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "I appreciate the call, Corinne. I'll be proceeding with the transfer." She asked if there was anything she could do to address his concerns. He said the transfer paperwork had already been initiated, and he would be following up with the receiving institution that afternoon. She asked if he wanted to discuss the situation further before making a final decision. He said the decision was final. He ended the call and went back to his notes. He understood what the offer was. It was not an apology, it was a retention strategy. Keep the $86 million in the building. Neutralize the account manager who had seen too much and get everything back in place before Monday's audit. The salary increase was the price they were willing to pay for his silence. The title adjustment was a way of making the silence feel like a promotion. He wasn't interested. That evening, Iris came home from school and found her father at the kitchen table with his laptop. 3 yellow legal pads covered in notes, and an expression she recognized as the one he got when something had stopped being a suspicion and started being a conclusion. She set her bag down, poured herself a glass of water, and asked, "How bad is it?" He told her what he'd found: the fee pattern, the client complaints that had been managed rather than resolved, the way the charge appeared to have been structured specifically to fly under the threshold of formal review. He didn't soften it, and he didn't inflate it. He gave her the same version he would have given a colleague. Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So it's not just you." "No," he said, "it's not just me." She nodded once, pulled out her own homework, and sat down across from him. That was the extent of her reaction, not because she didn't understand the weight of it, but because she was her father's daughter, and her father's way of handling serious things was to keep working. 3 days after the termination, the asset transfer request reached the corporate operations desk at Arden Gate's headquarters, and Helena Rourke was notified before noon. Helena had been CEO of Arden Gate for 6 years. She had not reached that position by being slow to recognize a situation that required personal attention. An $86 million trust account initiating a full exit transfer, filed the same day as an employee termination at the originating branch. That was not a coincidence she could afford to ignore. She called Nolan directly. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Helena was careful, professional, and honest about the limits of what she knew. She did not dismiss his concerns. She also did not validate them, not yet. What she told him was that she was taking the matter seriously, that she had already requested a preliminary review of the Larchfield fee structure, and that she wanted to meet in person before the audit on Monday. Nolan agreed to the meeting. The conference room at the district office held 6 people comfortably and 8 uncomfortably. On the morning of the meeting, it held 9. Helena Rourke, Corinne Voss, Graham Deller, who had driven down from the district office and arrived with the practiced ease of a man who had never once been the most uncomfortable person in a room, the bank's general counsel, outside auditor Tessa Brandt, and Nolan. Graham opened the conversation before Helena had a chance to set the agenda. He was smooth about it, not aggressive, not visibly calculating, just efficient, in the way that powerful men sometimes are when they have decided the narrative in advance and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. He described Nolan as a valued former employee who had understandably reacted emotionally to a difficult personnel decision, and suggested that the most productive path forward was a structured resolution, reinstatement, enhanced compensation, a confidentiality agreement, and a commitment from Nolan to maintain the trust account at Arden Gate during a 60-day review period. His voice carried no threat. That was what made it threatening. Nolan waited until Graham finished. Then he opened the folder he had brought and placed it on the table. It contained 36 months of trust account statements with every L09 charge highlighted. It contained the 2 internal queries he had submitted and the non-responses he had received. It contained his client care notes, with the names and dates of every elderly account holder who had called about unrecognized fees. It contained a preliminary list compiled over 3 evenings of cross-referencing of more than 3,000 accounts at Larchfield that showed the same L09 pattern. And it contained one additional detail that changed the shape of everything. Multiple L09 charges had been described on client statements as a community courtesy fee, a label that implied voluntary charitable contribution, which meant customers who noticed the charge were likely to assume they had opted into something rather than been taken from. The room was quiet while people read. Tessa Brandt asked to see the security footage from the afternoon of the drawer discrepancy. She made the request directly to the bank's security representative, bypassing Corinne entirely. The response came back within 20 minutes. 12 minutes of footage from the relevant camera had been manually overwritten. The overwrite had been executed using branch manager credentials. Graham's expression did not change. He was looking at the middle distance, the way a person looks when they are running calculations they don't want visible on their face. Corinne was looking at the table. What Tessa found over the following 72 hours was worse than what Nolan had sketched. The L09 code had been active for 34 months. It had been applied selectively, not randomly, not uniformly, but with a targeting logic that became clear once she mapped the affected accounts by activity level and demographic profile. The heaviest concentration was in accounts belonging to clients over 65. small family businesses with infrequent login activity, scholarship funds, and charitable trusts with low transaction volume, and inherited accounts where the primary account holder had changed within the past 5 years, and the new holder hadn't yet established a regular review pattern. In other words, people least likely to notice and least likely to push back if they did. The system had a release valve built in. Any account that generated a fee complaint received an automatic refund and a 6-month suppression of the charge. The suppression timer reset silently. When it expired, the charge resumed. The account was flagged in the system as previously inquired, which, in practice, meant it had already demonstrated a willingness to call, and therefore needed to be handled more carefully. The fee amounts on those accounts were sometimes reduced slightly after the first complaint. Smaller, quieter, below the threshold of a second call. The total amount extracted across all affected accounts over 34 months was approximately $4.3 million. That revenue had flowed directly into Larchfield's fee income line. It had made the branch the top-performing location in the district for 3 consecutive years. It had been the primary basis for Corinne's annual performance bonuses. It had been the number Graham Deller cited in 4 separate presentations to the board as evidence that his district was operating efficiently and that his leadership model should be expanded to 2 additional regions. Miles called Nolan on a Wednesday night 9 days after the termination. He had not slept well since the day he signed the statement. He said this without being prompted, and Nolan let him say it without interrupting. Miles explained, in a voice that was steady, only because he was working to keep it that way, that Nolan had not touched the cash drawer on the afternoon in question. He had been at Miles's station to help with the wire transfer, had never moved closer than 3 feet from the drawer, and had left the area before Miles ran his end-of-day count. The $9 discrepancy had appeared after Corinne entered a manual adjustment using the LZO9 code, approximately 4 minutes before close. Miles had seen her do it. He hadn't understood what it meant at the time. He understood now. He also said that Corinne had told him, when she asked him to sign the statement, that if he refused, the missing $9 would become his problem. He was 26 years old, 8 months from paying off a car loan, and 18 months from being able to afford his own apartment. He had signed because he was scared. Nolan told him he had done the right thing by calling. He asked Miles if he was willing to put what he had just said into writing. Miles said he was. 4 days later, a local financial blog published a short item, anonymous sourcing, vague on specifics, suggesting that a former Arden Gate employee had been using the leverage of an 8-figure trust account to pressure the bank into reversing a legitimate personnel decision. The item described the former employee as a mid-level staffer with a history of internal complaints, and suggested the situation was a cautionary example of how disgruntled employees sometimes weaponized client relationships. Iris read it at school. A classmate had sent her the link without comment, which was its own kind of comment. That evening, she came home and didn't say anything for a while. She made tea, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at her father across the room before speaking. She didn't ask if it was true. She asked, "Do you need me to do anything?" Nolan sat down across from her. He said, "I need you to believe me, even when the whole thing looks messy from the outside." Iris looked at him. The way she looked at arguments, she was evaluating, not with doubt, but with the careful attention of someone who took honesty seriously enough to apply it to the people she loved most. "I already believe you," she said. "I just wanted you to know you could ask." Graham Deller moved 10 days before the formal hearing. He sent Helena Rourke a 3-page internal memorandum characterizing the LO9 code as a localized fee experiment initiated by Corinne Voss without district authorization or oversight. The memo was precise and detailed. It included email excerpts, approval timestamps, and a sequence of events that placed every meaningful decision inside the walls of the Larchfield branch. It did not mention that Graham had approved the original fee structure proposal in writing, or that he had received quarterly reports showing the L09 revenue figures without ever flagging a concern. The memo also included a section on Nolan, carefully worded, never openly, hostile, that described his transfer request as a destabilizing action, and suggested that any resolution should include conditions preventing him from making public statements about internal bank operations. Corinne received a copy of the memo from the bank's legal department, forwarded without comment. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She had known Graham for 4 years. She had taken his calls, hit his numbers, and built the thing he needed built. She had believed, in the way that people believe things they need to believe to keep functioning, that there was a version of events in which her performance record would protect her, that the relationship between them was professional enough to hold under pressure. The memo told her otherwise. She spent 2 days thinking about what that meant. On the third day, she called Nolan and asked to meet somewhere outside the city. The old Mercer Maritime dock facility had been sold. Years ago, the buildings were being converted into waterfront commercial space, and on a weekday afternoon, the site was mostly empty, the kind of in-between place that felt outside of ordinary time. Nolan had been there a few times since his father died, not for any particular reason, just because it was a place that felt honest about what it was. Corinne arrived first and was standing near the water when he got there. She looked like someone who had decided to stop managing her appearance, which, in her case, was its own significant change. She tried, briefly, to frame the conversation as a negotiation. She had information he needed, and she wanted to know what that was worth in terms of her own exposure. Nolan didn't engage with the framing. He asked her instead, how many of the 3,000 affected accounts belong to widows over 70? She didn't answer. She looked at the water. Then, without being asked directly, she said it plainly. She had chosen Nolan as the explanation for the $9 discrepancy because she had calculated that a single father who kept his head down and had never made trouble in 11 years was the kind of person who would absorb the accusation quietly and disappear. She had not chosen him out of malice. She had chosen him out of the cold certainty that he would cost her less than anyone else. She did not apologize, but her voice, by the time she finished, had lost the quality it usually had, the smooth forward momentum of someone always already moving to the next thing. It was just a voice. Before she left, she placed a waterproof envelope on the surface beside her. Inside was a small external drive. It contained the email chain between her and Graham going back 31 months. It contained the internal training document used to implement the L09 protocol. It contained a spreadsheet of flagged target accounts, annotated with activity scores and complaint probability ratings. And it contained an audio recording of a closed-door meeting between Corinne and Graham, captured on her phone 6 weeks before the termination, in which Graham had said, clearly and without ambiguity, "The $9 doesn't matter. What matters is that Nolan Mercer doesn't walk into that Monday audit." Nolan picked up the envelope. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the water, at the cranes and the half-renovated buildings, and the gray sky above the dock. Then, he thought about the employees at Larchfield Miles, the tellers, the loan officers, the people who had shown up every day and done their jobs without knowing what was running underneath. If the transfer went through and the branch collapsed under the weight of the investigation, some of those people would lose their jobs. If he pulled back, the bank might use his restraint as cover to minimize what had happened. There was no clean choice. There was only the choice that he could live with when it was over. He put the envelope in his jacket pocket and walked back to his car. The formal accountability session was held on a Thursday morning at Arden Gate's headquarters, in a conference room on the 14th floor that looked out over a city that had no idea any of this was happening. The room held 12 people. Helena Rourke at the head of the table, 2 members of the Independent Audit Committee, a representative from the State Banking Regulatory Office who had been quietly briefed 3 days earlier, the bank's general counsel, and 1 outside attorney, Tessa Brandt, with a bound report in front of her, Nolan, Miles, and Corinne. Graham Deller appeared on a screen at the far end of the table, his connection routed through his attorney's office, his background a blank gray wall that gave nothing away. Nolan had slept 6 hours the night before. He had reviewed his materials for the last time at 5 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of coffee, going through each item not to memorize it, but to make sure he understood the order in which the pieces connected. Iris had come downstairs at 6, seen him there, and made toast without being asked. She had set it beside him without saying anything, and he had eaten it without looking up from his notes, and that had been enough. Graham opened his defense the way he had opened every difficult conversation in his career, by controlling the first 5 minutes. He acknowledged the L09 situation as a genuine compliance failure. He expressed concern for affected customers. He used the word troubling 3 times in 4 sentences, in the particular way that senior executives use words like troubling to signal awareness without accepting proximity. Then he explained, methodically and with apparent regret, that the fee structure had been implemented at the branch level by Corinne Voss without district authorization, that his office had not been provided accurate reporting on the nature of the revenue it generated, and that the moment he became aware of the full scope of the situation, he had taken immediate steps to document his concerns and bring them to the CEO's attention. He was composed. He was credible. He looked, from a certain angle, like a manager who had been failed by a subordinate and was doing his best to navigate the consequences responsibly. Each statement was individually defensible. That was the architecture of it, not a single lie, large enough to catch, but a series of true adjacent claims assembled in a sequence that pointed away from him. Nolan waited. When Graham finished, Helena asked if anyone had a response. Nolan said he did. He did not raise his voice. He did not begin with an accusation. He started with a date 34 months ago and moved forward from there, 1 documented point at a time. He laid out the timeline of the L09 code's creation, the metadata on the bank's regional server, not the branch server. The regional server showed that the fee code had been built and tested in the district's own infrastructure environment before it was pushed to Larchfield's system. The code had never originated at the branch level. It had been deployed there. He presented the approval chain for the original fee structure proposal, 4 documents, each bearing Graham Deller's digital signature, dated across an 18-month implementation window. He noted that the quarterly district performance reports copies obtained through his attorney via a formal regulatory records request filed the previous week included line item L09, revenue figures, in the fee income breakdown, clearly labeled, every quarter for 2.5 years. Graham had signed those reports as well. He placed Miles's written statement on the table, a clear, detailed account of what had actually happened on the afternoon of the drawer discrepancy, including the specific sequence of events that produced the $9 shortfall and the circumstances under which Miles had been pressured to sign a statement he knew to be false. He played 38 seconds of the audio recording from Corinne's phone. Graham's voice came out of the speaker in the middle of the table, even and unhurried. The $9 doesn't matter. What matters is that Nolan Mercer doesn't walk into that Monday audit. The regulatory representative wrote something on his notepad and did not look up. Then, Nolan presented the recovered camera footage pulled from a secondary backup server that the branch's manual overwrite had not reached, retrieved by Tessa's team during their infrastructure review. The clip was 40 seconds long. It showed Corinne at the transaction desk at 4:43 in the afternoon, entering a manual adjustment on the drawer terminal. It showed the timestamp. It showed the code she entered. It did not show Nolan anywhere near the drawer. Miles, sitting 2 seats to Nolan's left, looked at the screen and then looked at the table. His jaw was set. He had known what the footage would show, but seeing it in that room, in front of those people, was different from knowing it. Tessa spoke for 11 minutes, summarizing the audit committee's findings. The L09 mechanism was not a rounding error, not a software anomaly, not an unauthorized local experiment. It was a deliberately engineered fee extraction system designed with specific targeting criteria, built on infrastructure that required district-level access to create, and maintained through a complaint response protocol that demonstrated operational awareness at every stage. The total confirmed extraction across affected accounts was $4.3 million. The revenue had been material to district performance metrics for 3 consecutive fiscal years. The performance metrics had been cited in board presentations. The board presentations had influenced capital allocation decisions. She placed her report on the table and folded her hands. Graham Deller, on the screen at the end of the room, was silent for the first time since the session had begun. Helena Rourke took a recess of 20 minutes. When she came back, she sat down and spoke without preamble. Arden Gate Bank would be filing a voluntary disclosure with the state banking regulator before the end of the business day. Full remediation payments would be issued to all identified affected accounts within 60 days, with interest calculated from the date of the first unauthorized charge. Graham Deller was being placed on immediate administrative suspension pending a formal separation. Corinne Voss's termination was confirmed, with full cooperation required as a condition of any severance consideration. The bank's general counsel would be coordinating with the regulatory representative on next steps. And Nolan Mercer's personnel record would be corrected in full, every notation, every flag, every reference to the $9 discrepancy effective immediately. The bank would issue a formal written acknowledgement that the termination had been without cause and that the disciplinary record had been fabricated. Helena said all of this in a measured, deliberate voice. She was not performing contrition. She was stating decisions that had already been made, in the way that people state decisions when they understand that the time for negotiation has passed. Then she looked at Nolan directly and said that she hoped he would consider maintaining the Mercer Maritime Legacy Trust at Arden Gate through the transition period. She acknowledged that no request of that kind could come with preconditions. She said, the bank intended to establish an independent whistleblower channel, transfer camera access authority away from branch management, and publish a full public breakdown of its fee structure within 90 days. She asked him to take the time to consider it. Nolan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I appreciate what you're committing to. I mean that, but trust doesn't come back in a meeting. It comes back over years, and the people who depend on this trust don't have the luxury of waiting to find out whether this institution becomes what it's describing today. My obligation is to place those assets somewhere with a record I can already verify. Not somewhere that's just beginning to earn one. Helena nodded. She did not argue. The $86 million transfer was completed 3 days later. Corinne left the building that afternoon without speaking to anyone. She took the elevator down alone, walked through the lobby, and pushed through the glass door into a city afternoon that felt indifferent to everything that had just happened inside. She had lost her position, her bonuses, and the version of her future she had been constructing for 12 years. She would spend the next several months cooperating with investigators, answering questions in rooms that felt nothing like the rooms she had imagined herself in. By this point in her career, she had known, walking into that conference room, that this was how it would end. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how small it would feel, not catastrophic, not dramatic, just small. 12 years of everything she had sacrificed, reduced to a formal separation agreement and a name in a regulatory filing. She didn't think about Nolan on the walk to her car. She thought about the 73-year-old woman who had called twice about fees too minor to make a fuss about. She thought about that for a long time. Graham Deller's situation moved more slowly, as situations involving people with attorneys and institutional complexity tend to do. The regulatory investigation took 14 months. At the end of it, he was barred from serving in a supervisory capacity at any federally insured financial institution required to disgorge a portion of the performance bonuses tied to L09 revenue, and named as a respondent in a civil action brought on behalf of affected account holders. He did not go to prison, but the career he had built, the board presentations, the expansion proposals, the carefully maintained reputation as a results-driven regional leader was over. Miles Renner resigned from Arden Gate 2 weeks after the hearing. He had not been asked to leave. Helena had made clear that his cooperation had been noted, and that his position was secure if he wanted it. But something about the branch no longer felt like a place he could go back to and simply do the work. Too much of what he had taken on faith there had turned out to be something else. He called Nolan on a Saturday morning and said he was looking for something to do next. Nolan told him he had just registered a business entity called Clear Ledger, LLC, and asked if Miles had any interest in being the first person on payroll. Miles said yes before Nolan finished the sentence. Clear Ledger operated out of a 2-room office in a building that smelled faintly of sawdust from the furniture restoration business on the ground floor. The work was not complicated to describe. The firm helped elderly individuals, family-owned businesses, charitable trusts, and community organizations review their financial institution statements for unexplained or recurring fee charges. In practice, it was detailed, patient, often tedious work that required the ability to read 200 lines of transaction data and find the 3 that didn't belong. Nolan was well suited to it. So, it turned out, was Miles who brought to the work a grim personal familiarity with what it looked like when a financial institution decided a client wasn't paying close enough attention. In the first 6 months, they worked with 41 clients, recovered a combined $218,000 in incorrectly charged fees across 11 institutions, and filed 4 formal complaints with state regulators. None of the cases involved amounts as large as what had happened at Arden Gate. Most of them involved amounts far smaller. $15 here, $40 there. The kind of money that people hesitated to pursue because the pursuit felt disproportionate to the amount. Nolan never let a client say the amount was too small to bother with. That was the one thing he was consistent about. Across every intake call, every initial review, every conversation with someone who apologized for bringing him a problem that felt minor. There's no such thing as a number too small if it was taken from you without your knowledge, he would say. That's the whole point. On the morning of Clear Ledger's official opening, Iris had come by before school to see the office. She had walked around the 2 rooms, looked out the window at the street below, and then turned to the one bare wall and asked her father why there was nothing on it. He told her he was waiting for something worth putting there. She had accepted that answers, with the slight skepticism she applied to answers that sounded meaningful, but weren't fully explained. Then she had gone to school. 3 months later, a letter arrived at the Clear Ledger office. The return address was handwritten a residential street, in a part of the city Nolan knew mostly from client files. Inside the envelope were 9 $1 bills and a folded piece of notepaper. The note said, "Thank you for paying attention to something we thought was too small to speak up about." It was signed with a first name only, Walter. Nolan recognized the name from a case that had closed 6 weeks earlier, an 81-year-old man whose account had been charged a recurring fee of $9 a month for 22 months. Before anyone caught it, the total recovery had been $198, plus interest, Walter had thanked them on the phone when the case closed, in the brief, slightly formal way that people of his generation sometimes expressed gratitude, and Nolan had told him it was no trouble and meant it. He stood in the office for a moment, holding the 9 bills and the note. Then he went to find a small frame from the supply closet and put the 9 bills inside it, arranged in a row with the note folded behind them. He carried it to the bare wall and hung it at eye level. Beneath it, he taped a strip of cardstock on which he had written, in his own handwriting, "No number is too small if it was taken from a person." Miles watched from his desk without saying anything. The formal letter from Arden Gate arrived. 6 weeks later, the official, written acknowledgement that his termination had been without cause, that the disciplinary record had been a fabrication, and that the bank accepted full responsibility for the harm caused by both the personnel action and the broader fee extraction scheme. It was thorough and precise and worded in the careful language of institutional accountability. Nolan read it once. He set it in the file he kept for the matter and did not bring it to the wall. The wall already had what it needed. On the last day, he had any official business at the Larchfield branch, a brief visit to close his personal checking account, a new teller, processed his paperwork, and mentioned that there was a $9 service fee for same-day account closure, but that if he wanted to leave that amount in the account, it would be waived and donated to the bank's community fund. Nolan looked at her for a moment. She was young, maybe 23, and she had the look of someone delivering a script in good faith, with no awareness of what the words might mean to the person standing across the counter. He smiled at her, not the polished professional smile he had used for 11 years in this building, but a quieter one. "I'll take the full balance," he said. "All of it." He thanked her, took the receipt, and walked out through the glass doors. He didn't look back. Nolan didn't win because he had $86 million. He won because he refused to let a lie go unchallenged long enough to become the truth. He won because he kept records when no one was watching, asked questions when no one was listening, and stayed calm in the exact moments when the system was counting on him to panic. The $9 was never about the money. It was a test, a quiet calculation that said, this person won't fight back. And the most powerful thing Nolan did wasn't the transfer. It was the decision, in that moment on the floor, to simply not disappear. Most of us will never manage an $86 million trust, but most of us have been in a room where something wasn't right, where a number was small enough to ignore, and a person was vulnerable enough to target, and we had to decide whether to say something or let it go. That decision, that small, quiet decision, is where it always starts. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and stick around every week. There's another one about the people who didn't stay quiet and why it mattered.